In the land of the free, slavery had been ended 90 years before, and the United States Constitution promised equality before the law. But in the 1950s in the South, where 10 million blacks lived, it was the state laws that counted. The daily lives of the black minority were governed by a mesh of local laws still enforced to keep blacks and whites apart.
Into the river they go. 1957, it was government-sanctioned racism. You had formal barriers to jobs, to freedom of movement. The Constitution of the United States did not protect every citizen.
People were starting to talk about integration, but white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan played on popular fears of what it could bring.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
In 1957, while segregation was being extended in South Africa, it was starting to come under attack in the United States. Arguing that the US Constitution rendered local segregation laws illegal, black Americans got the US federal courts to order schools to integrate. No blacks had ever been to the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. But 9 children became a test case to break the color bar. Ernest Green was one of them.
It was, at that time, the premier high school in the Mid-South. It always turned out large numbers of merit scholars, but it was a barrier. It was something that because I was a black kid, I could not attend there.
At first, the state governor used local reservists, the National Guard, to keep the children from setting foot in a whites-only school. Under pressure from Washington, he finally agreed to let them in.
We've just got a report here on this end that the students are in. That's right.
But when the white crowd waiting outside threatened to turn into a lynch mob, the children had to be evacuated to safety. Next day, President Eisenhower sent in the US Army to clear white objectors from the street and restore order. 16-year-old Ernest Green tried to go to school again, this time with an armed escort.
We were in a station wagon. In the front was an Army Jeep with a machine gun mount. The Jeep let us out. We got out. A cordon of soldiers surrounded us. We went down this walk, up those steps. It really was an exhilarating feeling that you had finally accomplished something. You could see the cameras and the people across the street, and that all of it was focused on the 9 of us going to this school. It was the realization that this was not the end, this was just the beginning.
Little Rock was a symbolic victory, though thousands of schools stayed segregated. As the civil rights movement spread across the country, it showed how mass action could succeed where court orders on their own had failed. Black Americans found they could start to change things when they joined together to boycott shops or employers who discriminated. At whites-only restaurants, they adopted sit-in tactics. In Tennessee, Bernard Lafayette was one of the protesters.
And would take seats quietly at the lunch counter. You would not say anything to anybody, but sit there until you're asked to be served. There was the waitress who was very panicky, walking up and down and very confused about what to do, and very clear that she was not going to serve us.
I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
Then there were these fellows with the ducktail haircuts, and they were walking behind us, so they would make cat calls. They would say, "What are you doing in here, jungle bunnies? You know, you get out of here. You're not going to get served in here."
And we sat at the counters, and I was praying when this lady, white lady, came and she put her cigarette out on my arm. So I calmed myself down. While I was calming down, she lit the rest of her matches and pulled my poncho out and dropped the lighted matches down my back.
Paul LaPrade was pulled off the seat of the lunch counter, and he was kicked and beaten on the floor. And so they decided they were going to make an example out of him because he was white.
I'm so glad. The police arrested the students who hadn't fought back, not their attackers. But the movement carried on. Within months, 50,000 had joined sit-in protests in 112 cities. In 1961, campaigners turned to the long-distance bus lines. Seats on the buses were segregated, like the waiting rooms. But volunteers calling themselves Freedom Riders ignored the rules and sat together. One bus was firebombed by whites. But groups of young protesters kept on traveling on the buses, including Jim Swerg.
I was going to sit in the front of the bus with Paul Brooks. Paul sat by the window, I sat by the aisle. The rest of the blacks and one white girl who went on, Salim McCullum, were going to sit in the back.
When the Freedom Riders crossed Alabama, Floyd Mann was in charge of state police and tried to give them protection.
We had placed 16 state trooper cars in front of those buses and 16 state trooper cars behind them. We also had an air reconnaissance flying over those buses just in case they'd put up some bridges or what have you and tried to sabotage those buses.
But at Montgomery, another police force from the city was meant to take over.
All of a sudden, as we got to the city limits of Montgomery, Alabama, all of the protection faded away. No more state troopers, no more helicopters.
As they drew into the bus station, a crowd appeared.
They sat on the bus for a little while, and I saw the mob begin to just build just like a kind of a river, you know, just growing.
You could see things in their hands, hammers, chains, pipes.
It was a frenzy. They just went, wow.
I'd get the nigger lover. I mean, I was the only white guy there.
They were screaming and hollering, and their faces were all frowned up until they grabbed Jim Swerg. And they took him and they knocked him over the rail. And they picked him up and they knocked him over the rail again. They knocked his teeth out.
I remember getting kicked in the spine and hearing my back crack and the pain. And I passed out again, and I woke up, and I was again in a moving vehicle with some very southern-sounding whites, and I figured I'm off to get lynched.
We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. Segregation must be broken down.
You're under arrest. We're marching on.
As the sit-ins and arrests continued, the civil rights movement gripped America. By 1963, over 36,000 people had been sent to jail for protesting segregation laws.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary.
Come on. To freedom land. Come on.
In August that year, 250,000 people, black and white, came to Washington to demand a civil rights act that would finally guarantee their freedoms.
We're going forward. We're going forward.
Martin Luther King spoke from the Lincoln Memorial.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. with little white boys and white girls as sisters in trouble. I have a dream today.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
In 1964, the same year Nelson Mandela was sentenced to prison, the Civil Rights Act introduced by President Johnson gave black Americans a real advance.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
The Civil Rights Act outlawed racial discrimination in all public places and gave black Americans the clear legal rights they'd fought for. But their very success provoked a final stand by Southern whites. Alabama's Governor George Wallace led the fight against an integrated America.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
When Governor Wallace stood in the door down at the University of Alabama, and he said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation now on, from now on, I said, no, sir. I said, you mistaken. It will not be segregation from now on.
The last great civil rights struggle in the South was waged to get all black Americans the right to vote. They had it in theory, but in countless Southern towns, local registrars refused to put them on the voting roll.
Every time you would go down there, they would make you come back next month, come back in 2 months' time. Or you may have to come back next year. And they intimidated us so much so, until some people just wouldn't go back.
In Alabama, only 10% of the black Americans were actually registered.
The number one trick was to ask questions that no one can answer, like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, right? They asked blacks that, but they didn't ask whites that. So you asked impossible and stupid and inane questions of people you did not want to vote, knowing that these had no answers.
On this side, now right here you interpret, in other words, you tell what it means. Just write your meaning, your understanding of it.
Can you explain the Constitution? Can you tell us what the Constitution means, every word of the Constitution? Well, we didn't know. It did not matter whether you had a PhD degree or no degree. They just would not register Negroes.
Selma, Alabama, was a center of white resistance and obduracy. When a group of teachers tried to present their case at the registration office, they were stopped by Sheriff Clark.
This courthouse is a serious place of business. You seem to think you've taken it for just to be Disneyland or something on parade. Do you have business in the courthouse?
We just want to pass.
Do you have any business in the courthouse?
The only business we have was to come by to the Board of Registers to register.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed. You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse, so we're not going to have it.
The group was led by C.T. Vivian.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
This is not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
The idea was to beat people down, beat them away, destroy them physically, destroy their right to even work in a town if they had the courage to even try to register to vote.
And you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. No, you don't have to beat us. Get out of here.
The act by Sheriff Clark was the normal act of the South.
This is the kind of violation of the Constitution, the violation of the court order, the violation of decent citizenship. You can turn your back on me, but you cannot turn your back upon the idea of justice. You can turn your back now and you can keep the club in your hand, but you cannot beat down justice. And we will register to vote because as citizens of these United States, we have the right to do it.
To protest the continuing voting violations, a march was organized from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery.
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
It was stopped by the police on the bridge out of the city. Television showed the scenes across the United States.
You see, as soon as people could see the faces, as soon as they could see what we were doing and what we were about, and understand that, so that it couldn't be lost in a plethora of words in the daily newspaper, all right? Then they could see it. It was obvious. This must stop, and full rights must be given to all of our citizens.
Civil rights workers rushed in from across the country. The president pledged his support. And with all of America watching, a column of 3,000 marchers made another attempt to cross the bridge out of Selma. We're going forward. One day there would never be such unity and optimism again. Though black Americans still faced poverty and individual prejudice, it was the high point of the civil rights campaign. A new act was rushed through Congress, guaranteeing the right to vote. Within 10 years, the number of registered black voters trebled to 3 million.
We're going forward. We're going forward. One day we're going to be free.